Hello, buenas tardes, good afternoon, and welcome to the CABE 2020 virtual community and another fabulous webinar in a series of special speakers made available to our CABE 2020 virtual community. My name is Jan Gustafson Correa, CEO for CABE, and while I really wish we could have been together in San Francisco last month for the CABE 2020 conference, it is really good to be together with you today virtually. We hope that you find yourself in a safe place, managing the continued circumstances due to COVID-19, and ready to join together with your CABE Familia today and over the next weeks via our CABE 2020 virtual community website and webinars. So to get us started, it's my great pleasure to introduce and welcome a dear friend and colleague, CABE's educational consultant, Laurie Nasrallah Miles. Laurie?
Hi, everybody. Welcome. We're so glad you've joined us. Today's webinar is being presented by an impactful researcher and practitioner in the field of biliteracy and English learner education, Sandra Mercuri. Her presentation is sponsored with the generous support of Velázquez Press and Caslon Publishing, both platinum level sponsors of CABE 2020. As we get ready for today's exciting session, I have a few housekeeping matters to share. As this is a webinar, the speaker's microphone will be active, and the participants' microphones will all be on mute. If you would like to pose a question during the presentation, please use the chat icon. It's on the Zoom control menu. You'll see it there at the bottom of your screen. Just click it, and the chat window will pop up so you can type in your comments and questions. For better focus, we won't be using the Q&A icon or window for today. After this webinar, we will post the recorded version on the CABE 2020 virtual community website so that you can re-listen and share it with others. No password needed. So sit back, relax, and get ready for 45 minutes of powerful online engagement and learning. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our special sponsors of CABE 2020, who will share a few words of welcome. Jonathan Ruiz of Velázquez Press and Marisol Lescano of Caslon Publishing. Marisol?
Hello from Caslon Publishing in Philadelphia. We are proud to co-sponsor Dr. Sandra Mercuri today with Velázquez Press, and we'd like to thank the folks at CABE for making this virtual community happen. We are also very excited to announce that Sandra has co-authored a new book with Caslon Publishing and her colleagues Sandra Musanti and Alma Rodriguez, titled La enseñanza en el aula bilingüe, Content, Language, and Biliteracy, that will be available this fall. The book is written in Spanish, not translated from English, and it responds to the request from the field for bilingual education books for pre-service and in-service teachers written in Spanish, so that teachers learn content and strengthen their pedagogy in Spanish. And now it is my privilege to introduce our co-sponsor from Velázquez Press, Jonathan Ruiz.
Thank you, Marisol. My name is Jonathan, and I'd like to welcome everybody to this webinar. I want to thank CABE for this opportunity to be able to reach you guys and offer some support during these highly needed times. I also want to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon. We know you're busy and that you have a lot of things to do, and it's good to take some time off to learn something new and share with others. So we want to thank you and welcome you. It's very pleasing to be here with you guys. We hope everyone's at home safe, and our prayers go out to those who have struggled or are struggling with COVID-19. If there's anything we can do to help, we want to be able to make sure that you guys know that there's a community here to support you. We're very excited to bring some very highly anticipated professional development from a wonderful academic. Dr. Sandra Mercuri is a professor at UT Brownsville. She brings nearly 20 years of teaching and training experience on bilingual education and biliteracy. We partnered with her to offer professional development on these topics and specifically on authentic biliteracy. So if you've got any interest on bringing her maybe to your district this summer or later the year, please feel free to reach out to me. I will post my email on the chat box. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Sandra Mercuri.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Marisol. Thank you all for being here. I am honored to be doing this webinar. First of all, I want to thank CABE for the invitation and Council on Velázquez Fres for the support on doing this. But also I want to express my utmost respect for teachers and administrators for the work that they are doing during these difficult times. Administrators running schools virtually and trying to provide an equitable education to all students despite the lack of virtual capacity that some of those students have at home, on top of their family life's daily struggles that many of the students we serve, we know they are going through. Also to teachers, what can I say to teachers? Teachers teaching their students virtually, learning curve up high, and at the same time juggling family life and homeschoolings of their own children. So my kudos to you of the work you're doing. So today, and considering the new reality we live in, I am grateful to all of you for making the time to be with us. So let's begin. And I want to clarify something. And I'm going to share my screen now, but I have retired as a college professor. So I'm not at UTRGV anymore. I'm a full-time grandmother and consultant. This is my new role in life. So let's begin with a question of what is interdisciplinary biliteracy. This is the latest work that I have been doing with my colleagues, Sandra Musanti and Alma Rodriguez, but also the work that I do with teachers, in-service teachers, trying to go deeper in their understanding of practice for serving emerging bilingual students in their classrooms. So this graph represents our interpretation of the complex work that teachers do in schools every day, developing biliterate skills of their students. So we see biliteracy, an interdisciplinary approach, as holistic and a dynamic process that really, that shows that the literacy practices are intertwined and enacted through the different content areas. The graph shows the content areas around because the literacy skills are embedded. So language arts is taught not only in language arts, but also embedded in the content areas. And we use content area topics when possible to bring to language arts time to teach through the medium of content. By doing that, all of the day, the literacy day, is connected as a spiral around an essential question, what we call a pregunta esencial, that allows the students to respond to this question from different lenses, the lenses of the language of the content areas. Now, when you look at the core of this graph, we want to represent that the literacy skills are developed through language intersections. And those language intersections allow the students to use their complete linguistic repertoire. What do we mean by that? Well, if you look vertically, is the academic language of Spanish and English that the students are going to have to use to demonstrate knowledge of the content areas. And they do that through language development intersections horizontally by using the 4 language domains that the students need to develop to a higher sophistication in their dominant language and to develop their second language as they engage in biliteracy practices at school. The other component that targets the whole complete linguistic repertoire is those cross-linguistic connections, those hybrid spaces that teachers create within their named language spaces. Like when we talk about the concept of translanguaging and translanguaging practices, and in the field, sometimes we are a little bit concerned about using certain terms. But the reality of schools is that there is a named language. Teachers are teaching this time in Spanish or this time in English, but there are spaces that they can create where they can make connections about those 2 languages of instruction. And that those are the cross-linguistic connection spaces that also facilitates biliteracy and kind of glues together this graph that we want to show as our way of interpreting how biliteracy develops in the classroom from an interdisciplinary perspective. Now, when we plan for this, there are two important aspects of the planning process. And this has to be strategically done, and it has to be intentional. Intentional in the use of the two languages that aligns to definitely a language allocation plan. So I'm teaching these subjects in English and these subjects in Spanish, or half day, or one day. Whatever the language allocation is, we need to be intentional about how we're going to use these two languages, because at the end of the day is what opportunities do we give students to access content? And they do that through the language pieces. So in the book and in the work that I do with Velázquez, we use two big concepts for the planning process. One is what we call macrostructures that come from Bunch, Cleveland, and Pimentel's from Stanford University work. And the other one is the concept of microstructure. So what do we mean by a macrostructure for biliteracy? The macrostructure is at the unit level and allows to map the intersection of language, literacy, and content for a grading period, for example. So some schools have 6 weeks grading period, some other schools have 9-week grading periods. So the macrostructure, when possible, should be organized around that time period. Through that time, the students have the opportunity to revisit and recycle concepts in a meaningful way from different perspectives. So that language content intersection is done across the disciplines and across the two languages. So what you see here at the right is an example of work that I have done with districts. So this is one macrostructure. And the color coding of those post-it notes represent different content areas. So it's how the teachers visualize the standards that they need to teach for this 9-week grading period and the connections that they see across those big ideas. So in a way, the macrostructure is the planning process of the unit, and then the teachers are going to have to take a closer look, more focus on the daily lessons that we call microstructures. So there are different steps for the planning. So I'm going to give you some examples. I'm going to give you all the steps, but a few examples just to bring to life some of these ideas. The first step is analyzing and selecting the content standards that interconnect in both languages, but we use the district scope and sequence. We just don't, if the district has a scope and sequence, we follow the district scope and sequence. So the difference is that in a bilingual context, one way, two-way, dual language, or bilingual, the way that we present the kids, the connections that we make are the difference. The standards, everybody's learning the same standards during the same period of time. It's the connections that we make that makes them, the delivery different. And the second step is once we have those connections, then we need to create an essential question that will allow to explore the unit from different lenses of the content standards. So let me give you an example. I use this example from 4th grade, and because the book is in Spanish, I'm just using the Spanish example. The examples mainly are gonna be done in Spanish. So here el título es Una mirada crítica al encuentro de dos mundos. El tema que se trata en esta unidad de 9 semanas es la conquista de América y los nativos americanos. La pregunta esencial que los estudiantes van a contestar es ¿qué impacto ha tenido la conquista europea sobre los grupos indígenas norteamericanos a través del tiempo? So, desde el punto de vista de las ciencias sociales, miran al impacto de la conquista en el tiempo, pasado y presente, la realidad de los grupos indígenas del pasado y la realidad del presente. También vemos desde este punto de vista los distintos grupos y sus adaptaciones al medio ambiente, a los recursos naturales, que motivaron los desplazamientos también. Y desde el punto de vista matemático, problemas matemáticos de resolución de distancias, de asentamientos, para conectar a lo más posible las distintas disciplinas. ¿Cómo logran esto? A través de la lectura, de escritura y de las conversaciones académicas en los dos idiomas. Entonces, Artes del Lenguaje está conectando todas estas diferentes áreas de contenido. Going back to the steps, we have these first two, so we're going to look at step 3. Step 3 is now we write content and language targets for the macrostructure. Content and language targets are the end product on the literacy side, on the language development side. So for example, this is directly related to what we call a summative assessment or a culminating project for this 9 weeks macrostructure. So the content targets is what is that the things that the students are going to learn, everything they are going to learn. They're going to learn about the different the explorations and the different Native American groups. That's my content target. My language target will be writing a compare and contrast essay about 2 different groups, for example, or doing a presentation about one particular group of Native Americans. So those are the content targets that are different from content objectives, because the content target is at the level of the unit. The language and content objectives are at the level of the lesson. And with that in mind, we design a summative integrated assessment. So for example, for the same unit that I just gave you the essential question, here we divided this culminating project in 2 parts. The first part is a history museum presentation that will be done in English. So it's something that the students will work in groups and will present about 2 different groups of Native Americans of their selection. And the second part is similarities and differences of the Native Americans, and is a comparative essay that they will write, but they will write it in Spanish. So all their learning will be manifested and demonstrated through 2 different projects that, as you see, it really demonstrates and uses the 4 language domains. And for that, the teacher creates different type of rubrics so the students know how they're going to be evaluated. So that requires auto-evaluations, peer evaluation, and teacher evaluation of the different part of the project. So we talk about the 4 first steps, and then the 5th step is when you, okay, if that's my goal, these are my standards, these are my targets, what materials, what genres we're going to use for students to have access to this knowledge, and what vocabulary, and the vocabulary has to be a bilingual vocabulary because we want the kids to be manipulating this information across the 2 languages. And are we going to use just nonfiction text, or are we going to use fiction and nonfiction text? So all that is what the teachers need to decide, because it goes from, I always look at this as an inverted pyramid. When you start is with the big idea and the standards, and then you start narrow it down to the genres, the vocabulary, and then from then you go into the lessons. And the last step is once you created and once you selected the standards, you're going to create like interconnected mini units where this definitely relate to the same topic, but the cluster of ideas are easier to manage because there are a smaller chunk of time within this 9 weeks grading period. So let me give you an example of how this may look like. The most important piece of this example is to demonstrate how the teacher leveraged on the students' complete linguistic repertoire. How the kids For example, they read fiction and nonfiction texts, and they write in both English and Spanish. They participate in academic oral discussions in the target language or on the language of instruction. It's not just always pick whatever language you want. Let me give you an example. For example, I'm reading to do my writing in Spanish, but I can gather information in 2 different languages. And then when I write in the language of instruction. Or a bit of the culminating project. The kids can gather information in any language or their preferred language, but one project needs to be presented in English and the other part of the project needs to be presented in Spanish. So allowing for that flexibility, you provide more equitable access to content to students, not only to access, but to demonstrate content. So, for example, this is a simple cycle of how these teachers have used the 2 languages across the disciplines to demonstrate knowledge in this particular unit. The students read different type of text. So here you see Encounter by Yolen and other nonfiction text that gives you the historical perspective, but the other one is a fictional text that I love that book because these books gives you the opportunity to work from point of view. That is the language arts skill. The Encounter book gives you the perspective of the exploration from the child, a Taino child perspective, when he sees what happens when they arrive. The ones from the history perspective is the historical perspective for this. So very different perspectives for the writing. So then this reading continues with a compare and contrast of point of view. How are the 2 groups presented? And it's interactively done with the teacher, and it's where the teacher actually shows the structure of a comparative essay and then aligns with the key vocabulary like furthermore, similar to, different in the way, the vocabulary that they need to show compare and contrast. For discussions, the kids are using both languages. So sometimes it's Spanish time, I speak in Spanish, sometimes it's Spanish time, but in my small group, I speak Spanish or English, but then I report back in Spanish, or vice versa. But there is always a language of instruction that at some point kids need to use. Then the kids move into the more narrow part of the project that is now looking not from the explorations, but for the Native Americans. So they read books in English and Spanish, gathering information. And then with their partners, they do a compare and contrast. They are preparing for their independent part of the project, that is the writing of the essay. And with that, they will, with the teacher, they will take some of the transition words that they use in the compare and contrast paragraph, and now they are aligning and doing a comparison with the same vocabulary, but in English, in Spanish. So English and Spanish vocabulary for compare and contrast allows them to use when they need to write their own writing comparative essay. So in this example, you see how the languages are used that are very strategically and intentional, and the project and the assessment piece are divided between these 2 languages. So the second piece, and we are finishing with 2-3 slides from here, so will be the microstructure. And the microstructure is, okay, we have all this planning, now let's look at the lesson. What is that I do day to day in the classroom to achieve my target? So it's where the teachers use the specific strategies to access the content, and they do it through reading, writing, talking, and thinking processes. So with the little kids, and this is part of the materials that I work with Velázquez, is what they call authentic biliteracy development. These little books or big books that we use have the characteristics of being written by native speakers. So an authentic biliteracy has the root in the sociocultural skills where the kids can see themselves in the stories, when the stories represent their cultures and their traditions or the things that they know from home. So this selection of text allows for that. So they are all connected because they share a theme and the vocabulary, but there is no translation in this. So you have a book in Spanish for science and a book in English, and they are both related to planting seeds, but there is not the same story. So for example, at the lesson level, the lesson will have, we will read this book that is called Sabores Distintos, and it talks about a kid. In the Spanish version, the boy goes with the mother to the mercado, and in the English version, the kids go with the father to the supermarket. So the reality of both language groups, and then the students will learn about sabores y colores de frutas al escuchar una lectura en voz alta, probar la fruta y discutir con sus compañeros. That's what I do in one lesson, in one sitting. My teacher reads, we look at the fruits, we taste them, we talk. And for talking, my teacher is giving me some linguistic support, and that linguistic support are my sentence stems. A mí me gusta comer manzanas. And then I bring the skills. Manzana comienza con M, is identification of beginning sound, but it's contextualized in the lesson. It's not taught in isolation. And then the last layer that we want to talk about is that idea of the conexiones interlingüísticas or cross-linguistic connection, even when we start in pre-KK. So, for example, you do similar sounds, and I can do supermarket and supermercado and have the kids identify the first sound in those two words. Or when I start reading the books, I have pineapples and I have piñas. So I can talk about the use of the beginning sound and this fruit, that is the letter P. Or I can go with more difficult sounds, the letter J. And we can start with names because that is easier for the kids, but then we can just go with the words that are here, jugosas or juicy. So in one is the H sound and the other one is the J sound. So other things that teachers want to do that is not phonology could be looking at these two books that are the related pair and look at capital and lowercase letters. How do we use those in Spanish and English? Or how do we capitalize the letters in a title? So these are options that, but the teachers is not going to do all of it in a lesson. The teacher can pick one of those things in a lesson. So to finish, I don't want you to answer this question now, but I wrote two questions that if you want to take a screenshot of this, is for you to share with others. So how would you explain interdisciplinary biliteracy to someone who has not attended this session? What are some things that you took from the graph and from the explanation and the example that will make a simple explanation to others that wants to start doing interdisciplinary biliteracy in their classrooms? Or what steps do you remember that are important in this planning process at the macro level or at the micro level that you want to take with you? And so this is more for the future when you maybe look at the handout that I sent, or so keep thinking. These are the two most important pieces of this short presentation that maybe you want to continue to work through these ideas and maybe do some of these things in your classroom if you're not doing it right now. So with that, I want to finish with this slide, and then I'm going to, I think Lori will open up for questions, and maybe she will select the questions to answer.
Hi, everyone. Wow, that was a lot of great, really great information. Thank you so much. Our participants have been very active in the chat. I can barely keep up. We have so many questions. We won't be able to get to all of them today, but we will download the chat and the questions and the comments and send them to you, Sandra, and then you can answer them and we'll post them afterwards. But to get started, several people have been asking if the presentation will be shared with participants, and yes, it will be posted on in our virtual community, and you can also download it from there as well. Gerardo Guzman Rico, he was looking at the chart that you had at the beginning on interdisciplinary biliteracy, and he's wondering if that is available for purchase.
It's not available for purchase as is, but it's part of the book, the catalog book. So we have it there, and we have a very extensive detail of the describing what all these pieces mean. So that is more a question for Marisol. I'm hoping that it's coming up in the fall, and I'm sure it will. But I think that all the pieces on the steps is also a template that we have in the appendix of the book. So a lot of those things are part of that book that I share with you today. And all the information from the microstructure are in this teacher's guide from the Pathways to Biliteracy that I wrote for Velázquez Press. So there are tons of ideas there of literacy practices for the little ones.
Great, thank you, Sandra. We have a question from Wei Lai. Are these methods also applicable to teach Chinese?
Yes, I work extensively with Houston ISD, that they have different language partners. For most of their programs are Spanish English, but they have Mandarin English, Arab English, French English. And yes, their teachers attend their practice. This is exactly the same. This type of methodology for planning is not attached to a program model. This is curriculum development. So sometimes I work with districts that has two-way programs, regular bilingual. They call it regular bilingual. That makes me laugh because I don't know, the rest may be irregular bilingual. I don't know. It's just the late exit bilingual programs, and they have ESL or English only. When we develop the curriculum, the integration is one curriculum. But if you are ESL or English only, you do all in English. If you are bilingual and you have 70% of English and 30% of Spanish, then you distribute the languages accordingly. And if you have a 50-50 model, then half of that is going to be done in English and half of that is going to be in Spanish. So the planning process includes resources in those languages. Now, when it goes to the skills, if the skill is not transferable, then it's going to have to be specific to the language of instruction. Okay. But yes, it is applicable. Even the cross-linguistic connections, I have learned a lot about Mandarin English connections, especially in the sentence structure. They operate pretty similarly in the way that we can show the kids how to organize sentences, the word order in a sentence in English and Mandarin, for example.
Thank you, Sandra. We have a question from Alexaida Perez Cortes. When do you recommend to start the analysis of the macrostructure? At the beginning of the year and continue with the microstructure on each marking period? Grading period?
The macrostructure is for every grading period. So you create like a plan. You map out what are you going to do, how the content is going to be distributed, how the concepts align to one another and connect. And once you do that, then you need to start developing daily lessons that are going to help you materialize that macrostructure that you plan. So let's go back to the example on the writing piece. The teacher did all those lessons, and in one day she focused on reading different type of text and analyzing text and doing text to subtext to text connection or intertextual connections. Another lesson was to create a list of transition words and maybe use a mentor text to show how you write a compare and contrast essay. Another lesson was to write with the students that paragraph comparing the point of view. So how did she get to the independent writing of the students? Those are a series of mini lessons that allows to bring the macrostructure to life on a daily basis.
Great, thank you, Sandra. We have a question from Letis Elifson Bracco. What extra support would you use in the interdisciplinary biliteracy plans when you have third language native students?
The support that you provide, first of all, is the use, so you have a third language, depending on what language that is, if you can find some resources to send home to use with the parents, or maybe materials that could be used as a preview for the lesson that you are teaching the next day in whatever language you pair, Spanish, English, for example. But then you need to treat both languages in this case as ESL students. So you need to scaffold Spanish and you need to scaffold English for those who are a third language speakers in those cases. But then you need to find other ways like that preview or review in that other language by having people who may speak that language in school that could support that student, or finding resources that could be sent home for parents. So for example, let's say you have a Vietnamese student and you can have a hold or talk to the parents, and you're doing like the life cycle of living things. Maybe the parents can support that in Vietnamese. So when the child comes home, comes school the next day, they have built a little bit of schema. So when you teach in Spanish or you teach in English, regardless of what language you use for that, the students have a little bit of understanding what you're using. You can also send pictures home. So anything that could be some support from home, especially with those languages that we don't have access to a lot of resources here in the States.
Thank you. A question from Maria. How do you suggest we support students with fluency in Spanish language arts in distance learning when the resources are not in the house?
That's a difficult one. I think everybody's learning how to do that the best possible. While there is no resources in the homes, that is very common of many of the students we teach. One of the things that this time has created is a widened gap between the haves and the have-nots. That's a reality that we all face. And those kids who need the most are the ones who have less access nowadays. Even though the schools may give them a computer, but then there are 4 siblings trying to figure out how to work that computer with no good connectivity at home. So we acknowledge that. But for the fluency, there are a lot of resources that you can use to electronically, that you can have them read and practice. And then I'm not sure how your teaching is set up, but in the districts that I work with, teachers actually have specific times that they meet with students for different things. In some cases, they do kind of small groups for reading to keep them with the fluency, with the reading. Sometimes other teachers allows for students to do choral readings with her to continue to practice depending on the levels that they have. But it's an adjustment. It will depend with the ability that the teachers have, not only with literacy, but also with technology and the availability of the students to access those resources. I'm sorry, but I don't have really a perfect answer for that. I think we are all trying to figure out what to do at this point. You're mute.
Sorry about that. We're all still learning, aren't we? We have a question from Jody. She says, you mentioned in the 4th grade unit that you would create an anchor chart with the transition words in Spanish and English. When would you plan on students using these transition words in their English writing? Would you plan for this opportunity within the same unit? Would you hold students accountable for using language structures in each language?
Yes, that's a great question. The anchor chart, the teacher started to creating it and discussing how those words are used when she did the model lesson of the comparing the point of view of the Native Americans and the conquerors in the first example of writing in English. So they look and analyze mentor texts on how those words were used, the type of language that they were used. If you look at Mary Schlepliger and Luciana de Oliveira, they did an extensive study before on how people use adjectives to describe the conquerors and the Native Americans and how people are perceived. So they use the analysis to really look at all this part of speech to help them analyze how they can create their own. But before they went into writing their own, because the structure of a compare and contrast essay is the same in English and Spanish. We may use the order of words in a sentence differently, but we have signal words for compare and contrast in both languages. They are not cognates, but they are used and they mean the same things. So the teacher built all that understanding to the final project in Spanish in English. So there was a lot of work of the compare and contrast through English instruction and then application during Spanish instruction. Now, the other thing is that the kids, in order to do the presentation of the two groups in English, they needed to also write and read extensively about these two groups. So it was done differently, but it was targeted simultaneously through the preparation for these two projects. Now, there are different ways that you can do it. This teacher did it very masterfully, but if not, when teachers are new and they're starting to look through this, sometimes we said, okay, we're gonna be doing this type of writing in Spanish this week or 2 weeks, and then we're gonna do another piece, but in English. It may not take 2 weeks because we already learn about the structure and how to do it, but then we can take 1 week and do another one independently or with a teacher doing it in the other language. So different ways that we can do that. And yes, you need to make the students accountable for learning it or at least applying the same skills in the parent language.
Thank you, Sandra. We have several questions around the role of translanguaging. One teacher is asking about if one's teaching in English and one is teaching in Spanish, how do we make those connections when we're separating the languages? Do we do some kind of translanguaging?
Yes.
Would that be the English teacher or the Spanish teacher?
I think I tried to say it a little bit at the beginning, and this, you know, the field is very divided about translanguaging. But we wanted to make sure that we understand, we explain that in the book in particular, our book is a translanguaging example. We start the book with an introduction in English to set up the stage of the big ideas, and then the text is in Spanish, and then we conclude with the final thoughts in English, bringing everything that we have said in Spanish in English, but we're not translating. We are really anchoring the discussion at the beginning and closing the discussion at the end. We also have some bubbles throughout the book in English to highlight some of the key vocabulary to allow for all kind of reading with different proficiency levels to be able to access the content. So with that being said, this is what we think about translanguaging. So I'm the Spanish teacher, for example, and I need to teach in Spanish. And I need to make my students accountable for Spanish language development. However, there are spaces that I can create within Spanish time where the students can negotiate meaning in the language that they feel more comfortable doing it. And then I want them to produce in the language of instruction. So what is that my kiddos need? So I may give them sentence stems to be able to report back in the language of instruction. Sometimes, for example, math is in English, but then the kids are working in small groups, and in order to understand to a deeper level, the kids can be speaking English and Spanish simultaneously to clarify the misconception. But at the end of the day, when they show their word problem, it has to be written in English, and the teacher could provide some support to do that. So there are opportunities within your language. It's more on the student's part that translanguaging should be facilitated, not on the teacher's part. We don't want teachers to be constantly moving between the languages, if possible. Because for many classrooms, we are the role models of the language. So we want to stay in that language. But We also need to acknowledge that sometimes for some students, if we said, oh, no, this is Spanish time, then there is no language development, there is no language production, and there is limited access to content. So then you start seeing conceptual gaps.
Thank
So
you,
yes, there is a space.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. We have a lot of other great questions, and we will download those, send them to you, and then post your answers to the additional questions. Thank you for that motivating and informative presentation. It's a really valuable resource for biliteracy instruction and a powerful addition to our CABE 2020 virtual community webinar series. Today's webinar can be accessed by everyone on the CABE 2020 virtual community website, and will also be available through our friends at Caslon Publishing and Velazquez Press. Sandra's book, Pathways to Biliteracy, Teacher's Guide, is part of the Velazquez Authentic Biliteracy program and can be accessed at www.velazquezpress.com and www.caslonpublishing.com, velazquezpress.com and caslonpublishing.com. Before we close, I'm excited to share one more announcement. We will be welcoming our next webinar speaker, Huda Esa, tomorrow, May 6th, right here at 2 p.m. You won't want to miss this session. I know I'm really looking forward to it. Again, a big thank you to you, Sandra Mercuri, to Caslon Publishing and Velazquez Press, and most importantly, thanks to all of you for joining us here today, here in the CABE 2020 virtual community. On behalf of the CABE Board of Directors and our entire CABE team, we genuinely hope that you have felt that CABE connection, inspiration, and love, just as if we were gathered in San Francisco at the CABE 2020 conference. Please stay safe, be well, and remember that together we are #CABE strong. We'll see you next time. Hasta la próxima.
Thank you.